So I am Rachel, and I am a third-year RIMO, and this is my first year as a municipal liaison. So if you guys need anything or have any questions, I'm very happy to help out. I've won Nano once. That was last year, 2012. So I'm very excited for 2013 because I'm going to win again. I'm excited, and I hope all of you do too. Just a little bit of background about me, why I think I can teach this workshop. I have written 2 novels. The first one I self-published earlier this year in July, and the second one I wrote last year. I'm not an expert by any means on anything about writing plot, character, dialogue, what have you, but the reason I wanted to teach the dialogue workshop is because it's my favorite thing to write, and usually when people compliment my writing, it's because of the dialogue. So hopefully I have something that I can impart on you guys. I'm not like a lot of other writers who see their plots and their stories as movies in their head. I hear character voices. I hear people having conversations. So I think that a lot of times comes out in my dialogue, and I'm hoping to kind of impart some of that into you guys. I don't know if I'll be any good at it, but we're going to try. To start off, I want to say that this is a very interactive workshop, so I'm going to be asking you guys for a lot of input. You can see I have some things up here we're going to add to these boards as we go. But to start things off, I'm going to read. I'm a huge Harry Potter nerd, so I apologize if you're not. That just makes me sad for you. But I think J.K. Rowling is an incredible writer, and one of the things that she does really, really well is dialogue. So I'm going to read just a couple pages from The Sorcerer's Stone, one of everybody's favorite parts, I hope. And we're going to talk a little bit afterwards about what we learned from the dialogue in this passage, and then we'll go into my other things. Okay. The giant squeezed his way into the hut, stooping so that his head just brushed the ceiling. He bent down, picked up the door, and fitted it easily back into its frame. The noise of the storm outside dropped a little. He turned to look at them all. "Couldn't make us a cup of tea, could ya? It hasn't been an easy journey." He strode over to the sofa where Dudley sat frozen with fear. "Budge up, you great lump," said the stranger. Dudley squeaked and ran to hide behind his mother, who was crouching, terrified, behind Uncle Vernon. "And here's Harry," said the giant. Harry looked up into the fierce, wild, shadowy face and saw that the beetle eyes were crinkled in a smile. "Last time I saw you, you was only a baby," said the giant. "You look a lot like your dad, but you've got your mom's eyes." Uncle Vernon made a funny, rasping noise. "I demand that you leave at once, sir," he said. "You are breaking and entering." "Ah, shut up, Dursley, you great prune," said the giant. He reached over the back of the sofa, jerked the gun out of Uncle Vernon's hands, bent it easily into a knot as if it had been made of rubber, and threw it into a corner of the room. Uncle Vernon made another funny noise, like a mouse being trodden on. "Anyway, Harry," said the giant, turning his back on the Dursleys, "a very happy birthday to you. Got something for you here. I might have sat on it at some point, but it'll taste all right." From an inside pocket of his black overcoat, he pulled a slightly squashed box. Harry opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a large, sticky chocolate cake with "Happy Birthday, Harry" written on it in green icing. Harry looked up at the giant. He meant to say thank you, but the words got lost on the way to his mouth, and what he said instead was, "Who are you?" The giant chuckled. "True, I haven't introduced myself. Ruby is Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." He held out an enormous hand and shook Harry's whole arm. "What about that tea then, eh?" he said, rubbing his hands together. "I'd not say no to something stronger if you've got it, mind." His eyes fell on the empty grate with the shriveled chip bags in it, and he snorted. He bent it down over the fireplace. They couldn't see what he was doing, but when he drew back a second later, there was a roaring fire there. It filled the whole damp hut with flickering light, and Harry felt the warmth wash over him as though he'd sunk into a hot bath. The giant sat back down on the sofa, which sagged under his weight, and began taking all sorts of things out of the pockets of his coat. A copper kettle, a squashy package of sausages, a poker, a teapot, several chipped mugs, and a bottle of some ambered liquid that he took a swig from before starting to make tea. Soon the hut was full of the sound and smell of sizzling sausage. Nobody said a thing while the giant was working, but as he slid the first 6 fat, juicy, slightly burnt sausages from the poker, Dudley fidgeted a little. Uncle Vernon said sharply, "Don't touch anything he gives you, Dudley." The giant chuckled darkly. "Your great puddin' of a son don't need fattening any more, Dursley, don't worry." He passed the sausages to Harry, who was so hungry he had never tasted anything so wonderful, but he still couldn't take his eyes off the giant. Finally, as nobody seemed about to explain anything, he said, "I'm sorry, but I still don't really know who you are." The giant took a gulp of tea and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Call me Hagrid, he said. Everyone does. And like I told you, I'm keeper of keys at Hogwarts. You'll know all about Hogwarts, of course. No, said Harry. Hagrid looked shocked. Sorry, Harry said quickly. Sorry, barked Hagrid, turning to stare at the Dursleys, who shrank back into the shadows. It's them that should be sorry. I knew you weren't getting your letters, but I never thought you wouldn't even know about Hogwarts, crying out loud. Did you never wonder where your parents learned it all? All what? Asked Harry. Oh, what? Thundered Hagrid. Now wait just 1 second. He had leapt to his feet. In his anger, he seemed to fill the whole hut. The Dursleys were cowering against the wall. Do you mean to tell me, he growled at the Dursleys, that this boy knows nothing about anything? Harry thought this was going a bit far. He had been to school after all, and his marks weren't bad. I know some things, he said. I can do, math and stuff. But Hagrid simply waved his hand and said, about our world, I mean. Your world, my world, your parents' world. What world? Hagrid looked as if he was about to explode. Dursley! He boomed. Uncle Vernon, who had gone very pale, whispered something that sounded like Mimblewimble. Hagrid stared wildly at Harry. But you must know about your mom and dad, he said. I mean, they're famous. You're famous. What? My mom and dad weren't famous, were they? You don't know. You don't know. Hagrid ran his hands through his hair, fixing Harry with a bewildered stare. You don't know what you are? He said finally. Uncle Vernon finally found his voice. Stop, he commanded. Stop right there, sir. I forbid you to tell that boy anything. A braver man than Vernon Dudley would have quailed under the furious look Hagrid now gave him. When Hagrid spoke, his every syllable trembled with rage. You never told him? Never told him what was in the letter Dumbledore left for him? I was there. I saw Dumbledore leave it, Dursley. And you've kept it from him all these years? Kept what from me? Said Harry eagerly. Stop! I forbid you! Yelled Uncle Vernon in a panic. Aunt Petunia gave a gasp of horror. Go boil your heads, both of you, said Hagrid. Harry, you're a wizard. Okay, so I was also a theater geek in former life. Couldn't tell from that. So let's talk a little bit about that passage. We've got a lot of things happening. From the dialogue, what did you learn about the scene and the characters? Anybody? Oh, come on. You had to learn something.
I can do some math.
Yes.
Impression of young Harry.
Yes. He's not sure what's going on. He's confused. What else?
He learned that he didn't know who he was.
He didn't know who he was. There's this whole big world out there that he has no idea, and somehow he belongs to it. What else? Huh?
And he's famous.
And he's famous. Yes. What?
Hagrid, who he's physically huge. His voice is huge. Everything.
Yes.
I mean, right before that is when they talk about like his hands the size of a trash can.
Exactly. He's got a big presence.
He's just enormous. Everything about him is enormous.
Yes, exactly. Do you feel like there's building tension in the scene? Like, the more you read it, the more you want to know what's going to happen. What's this thing that Harry doesn't know? Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know that there is a big secret. I mean, obviously the last line you can kind of figure out some of what that is, but yeah, you're building the tension through it.
Building tension. So that's kind of some of the things that dialogue does. Dialogue moves the plot forward. So in this case, moving the plot forward, he meets Hagrid. He learns that he's a wizard. He's somebody who's famous, and he's going to get to go to a wizarding school. Okay, plot. Tension. He had no idea any of this was happening. There's a fight between the Dursleys and Hagrid. And Harry's super confused the whole time, so tension. And character development. We learn Harry's kind of humble. He doesn't really, think as much of himself as maybe the Dursleys do. The Dursleys are just jackasses. We learn Hagrid is a protector and maybe sometimes doesn't always control his temper the best, right? So all that in 3 pages. And not all of it was dialogue, but a lot of it, was dialogue. You're learning so much about the entire story. That's how powerful dialogue is. The impact of it is enormous on your story. So I'm going to kind of talk about each of these things, and as I go, please feel free to jump in, add your own comments and thoughts. You're all writers here, even if you haven't written a novel yet. you're thinking about it. So you all have thoughts in your heads about some of this stuff. So please shout out things. Moving the plot forward with your dialogue. And this is one rule that I want to say that doesn't just apply to dialogue. It kind of applies to everything that you're writing, but with dialogue in particular, if it doesn't move your plot forward, get rid of it. If there's no purpose to your dialogue, if there's no extending the story, moving the story forward, it's probably not necessary, and it's probably just going to be something that your readers skip over. You don't ever want your readers skipping over anything that you're writing, right? You want them to read every word and gobble it up like it's candy. Like the kids, they're almost gone. That's how you want your dialogue to be. So moving plot forward. Backstory. Backstory doesn't exactly move your plot forward, but sometimes it's important. So you want to consider it when you are writing your dialogue. Oftentimes you're going to have characters who are meeting for the first time. They're going to need to know things about each other. They're going to ask questions about each other. You want those questions that they're asking and the answers that they're giving to move your plot forward. For example, in Harry Potter, Harry's new to the Wizarding World. He doesn't know a lot of what's going on, but he's meeting a lot of characters who do. Ron is his guide through the Wizarding World because Ron grew up in it. So when he meets Ron, all these questions he has, chocolate frogs, Quidditch, all these things, platform 9 3/4, Ron is able to show him what these things are. And oftentimes their dialogue, especially in the first couple books, is Harry learning things about the Wizarding World from Ron. And that's all backstory that Ron knows that Harry doesn't. And that's a great way for your readers to be introduced to things in your world without giving them the dreaded info dump. And you don't want to do it all at once either. You don't want to have a conversation where Harry's like, so Ron, tell me all about the Wizarding World. And Ron says, okay, well, we've got Quidditch and we've got chocolate cauldrons and we've got chocolate frogs and Birdie's every flavor bots, all these things. You can't do it all back to back to back because then again, your reader's gonna get bored. They're gonna know what's supposed to be happening here. It's not supposed to be just these two characters having a conversation about everything Harry doesn't know. So backstory, you can utilize it in your dialogue, but don't overutilize your dialogue for that. Secrets and plot twists. This is another great way to use your dialogue. Every character has a secret, even if they're the sweetest, nicest person in the world. Every character has something they don't want other people to know. And at some point in your story, they might reveal it to somebody. And it's a lot more interesting if they reveal it to another character as opposed to just revealing it to the audience. The audience might know about it earlier on, but if they tell it to their frenemy who they haven't liked the entire book, it's going to be a lot more exciting, right? So secrets and plot twists are a great thing to introduce into your dialogue. And think about your characters when you're writing these kind of things. How are your characters going to reveal their secrets? Do they get drunk and blurt it out accidentally? Do they feel vulnerable because a traumatic event has just happened and they're crying on somebody's shoulder? Do they trust the wrong person and then find out they're being stabbed in the back? Your dialogue is dynamic when you have all these elements coming together. Does that make sense? So I want to ask you guys, what are some other ways that writers can use dialogue to move the plot forward? Foreshadowing, great. Okay, what else?
To direct the action.
Direct the action. Okay. What else?
Kind of catch people up.
Mm-hmm. So action that hasn't happened on stage, but we need
Or
people
just
to know
to
about.
summarize it.
Or summarize, yeah. Anything else?
Introduce new characters.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else? All right. So these are all great ways that you're moving your plot forward with your dialogue. So when you're writing a piece of dialogue, you're having a conversation, you need to be asking yourself, Is it doing any of these things? Is it moving my plot forward? Is this important to the overall story? And if it's not, you probably don't need it. Okay. The next really important purpose for dialogue is developing your characters. I'm a big advocate of show don't tell. I don't always practice it, but it's huge, especially when I'm editing. So dialogue is a great way of showing the readers your character's personality quirks and who they are and what they are without telling them. Okay. For example, a teenage girl from the Valley might use words like, so, oh my God, really, very. She's going to be a little bit lower on the verbiage scale. You know, she's not going to use high intellectual words. A doctor, on the other hand, might use precise medical terminology, even to the annoyance of his friends and family. A kindergarten teacher, when speaking to her class, might use small words and short sentences so that the kindergartners can understand what she's saying. So the way your characters are speaking can directly show who they are and what they are. Again, showing, don't telling. The author doesn't have to tell the reader that Chatty Cathy likes to talk if the author shows Cathy talking a lot. Does that make sense? Another example from Harry Potter, because I love Harry Potter. Hermione Granger. She's constantly, in the beginning of the series, quoting from her textbooks. Anybody has a question, she has an answer for it from a textbook, and it reads just like a textbook answer. And that becomes a huge trademark of that character. All throughout the rest of the series, she brings us knowledge from her textbooks. And that's one of the ways that she communicates with other people. That shows us a lot about her. Shows us she's kind of a smarty pants. Shows us that she likes to be right. Shows us that she's studious. You know, all these things, that she's smart, just by what she says to the other characters. What a character says can reveal their state of mind. So some characters are going to be open. They're going to be forthcoming. They're going to tell you everything about their lives, everything that's happened to them, all their secrets. They don't have secrets. They're just get them right out there, you know, right in front of you. Others, they're going to lie. They're going to hold back, or they're going to seldom speak at all. And all the ways that you have your characters interacting and speaking to other characters is going to say something about who those characters are. All right, so when a character's talking, what can it reveal about that particular character? Age, gender, socioeconomic status. When we were listening to Hagrid talk, did he sound like he had a full education? Not really. What else?
Occupation.
Place of birth.
What was that?
Place of birth.
Yes.
Reveal the temperament.
Yep. What else? Intelligence. Emotion. What else? How about the era that they're living in? Let's say you start off your chapter with dialogue, and it's set in Victorian England. You're going to kind of want to convey that, right? What else? Hobbies. I mentioned personality quirks. Let's say you've got a character who likes to sing just randomly. You know, you're going to introduce that in your dialogue. Anything else?
Relative relationship between two characters.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else? These are all great things, and you don't even have to think about this a lot of times. A lot of times, if you know your characters really well, they're going to reveal these things on their own in conversations with other characters, which is the awesome thing about writing and creating characters and creating stories, is that it, you know, you think it, and then when you start writing it, they kind of come to life on their own. All right, so the last purpose of dialogue that we're going to talk about is creating tension, and Phil talked about this in the plot. But you want your dialogue to do this as well as your prose. Dialogue is all about give and take. Dialogue is usually, sometimes it's just one person talking to themselves. I do that a lot. But a lot of times it's between two or more characters. So give and take, statement and response. But as in real life, your characters aren't always going to respond to one another the way that they each want them to. So for example, let's say character A asks character B, what's your name? Character B responds, why do you want to know? So character A was expecting one response. Character A was expecting, I'm Billy Bob. And character B is not willing to give character A what they were expecting. Character B is looking into the motives of character A. Character A could have no other motive other than, I don't know you, I want to know your name. But to character B, say character B is a spy who's not allowed to reveal their name, or character B has real major trust issues, or character B has been burnt in the past by people they've met off the street. There's a lot of reasons character B gave the response, why do you want to know? And that's all creating tension between those two characters. And the character relationships, we talked about this here, those are going to create tension as well. Do these two characters like each other? Do they love each other? Do they hate each other? Are they neutral? Are they intimate? Do they have a history? There's so many different relationships that you can show between people, student and pupil, commander and subordinate. All these things are going to come out in the dialogue, and they're all, the way that you have people speaking to each other is going to create tension. What's left unsaid can also create tension. So sometimes the best dialogue is what you don't actually write. Sometimes the dialogue that is left unsaid is really going to reveal a lot about the plot and the characters. So you want to get into your characters' heads. You want to reveal their thoughts as well as what they actually speak. Because the reader sometimes wants to know, are they lying? Are they telling the truth? Now, sometimes you want to keep that back, you want to hold that, and that's going to increase the tension as well. But other times, readers like feeling in the know about other characters, or about something that other characters are in the dark on. So what are some other ways that you can use dialogue to create tension?
Well, if you just had one person using kind of aggressive language.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Capitalization to show follow.
Okay, so the formatting of it is going to show tone and emotion.
I'm going to go back to Cole.
Oh, sorry, good point.
Same thing.
Okay. All right, so when you're writing dialogue, these three things, these three purposes should always be in the back of your mind. Your dialogue doesn't always have to have all three purposes in it, but it should have at least one. So your dialogue should be moving the plot forward, it should be developing character, or it should be creating tension somewhere in your story. Does that all make sense? Any questions about the purpose of dialogue before we move on? Awesome. Okay, so next, in actually writing your dialogue, one of the huge things that people always have questions about is dialogue tags. When do you tag? When do you not tag? How do you tag? I'm going to say that he said and she said are the best dialogue tags you can use. A lot of people say they get annoying, you want to use other things, but in reality, dialogue tags are pretty, when you use he said, she said, it becomes pretty innocuous. It's like a good pair of jeans. It goes with everything. Your readers are going to kind of glance over it. They're not really going to notice it, but they're going to be appreciative of it being there because that's going to help them know who's saying what. Whereas if you're using a dialogue tag in every sentence and it's like, he shouted, she cried, she wept, he blurted out, every single tag that you use, people are going to get real annoyed real fast because it's not showing them, it's telling them what's happening. Your dialogue should be conveying the tone and emotion of the speaker without you having to put those little extra tags on. Does that make sense? In the same, and you can use those substitutes for said. You can use those things, but you want to use them sparingly, and you want to use them when it's, again, fulfilling a purpose. Is it moving the plot forward, character development? Is your character saying something that doesn't fit the expected mode from what they just said? So, an example. Let's say two characters are in a fight, and you've got one of them shouting, really angry, and the other one is very calm and composed, and they simply whisper, "We're done." "We're done" whispered versus "we're done" shouting are two very different tones, and it's going to reveal something about your character. So when you're using those substitutes for said, you want to be careful about how you're using them and why you're using them. And then you've got qualifiers, the ly words: slowly, loudly, angrily, softly. They usually slow down your story, and they're oftentimes redundant. He shouted angrily. She asked quizzically. Your dialogue in this context should be clear enough that those qualifiers are not needed. If you have your characters talking and you've made it clear what state of mind they're in, the way that they're saying things, you should let the reader fill that in for themselves and really let them have that picture of what's happening. And then again, your tags don't always have to indicate the way a character is speaking. Tags can show what the character is doing, what's happening in the setting, what's going on around them. Those are my favorite types of tags because it can convey mood and setting and tone without it feeling like the author is imparting their judgment on the characters. So, for example, Jamie threw his hands in the air, releasing the stack of papers. The white sheets fluttered to the ground. "I give up." So here, we know that Jamie's the one who's speaking, and we didn't say Jamie said. We also know he's frustrated, clearly. He's, what he says, "I give up," says he's frustrated, but also what he's doing, he's releasing the stack of papers, says that he's frustrated. And then it tells us a little something about who he is, too. If that's the beginning of a book, if that was the very first sentence, I know it sucks, but if that was the very first sentence, you could automatically find out some things about Jamie. He could be a teacher grading term papers, and his students obviously are not very good writers. Or he could be a student who's stressed by the amount of homework he has. You give yourself options when you use dialogue tags that are showing what's happening. Bringing props in the setting. So kind of going back to there. Where is the conversation taking place? Are your characters in a restaurant? Are they at a bar? Are they in a ballroom? Are they at a coffee shop? Are they at a workshop for Nano? All of these things can be brought in with your dialogue tags. What are they holding in their hands? They have a bottle of water, a cigarette, an ounce of gin. I don't know how that term goes because I don't drink gin. But you see what I'm saying. You want to show what your characters are holding. What do they have close at hand? Is there a gun on the scene? Is there a sword? Maybe they're about to have a sword fight. I don't know. Are they gesturing with their hands like I like to do? There's a lot of things that you can do to show how the character is behaving in that scene. Are they fully involved in the conversation? Are they getting eye contact to one another? Or are they avoiding eye contact? Are they shrugging their shoulders? Are they sighing? So much that can be conveyed in your scenes and your writing dialogue. Any questions about tags or anything anybody wants to add? I'm so quiet.
Well,
Yes,
when do you think it is a good idea to just leave tags up altogether?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm really bad. So when I write, I typically will write pages and pages of dialogue with like 1 or 2 tags here and there, just because I know who's talking because I'm the one writing it. So it's really easy for me. So usually a lot of times when my beta readers read it, their biggest critique is that I don't have enough dialogue tags, and so I have to go back and add some in. I think that a good rule is you can have 2 exchanges without a tag. So if you have 2 people talking, you can have 4 lines of dialogue, and it's pretty easy to keep track of. But after that, your readers are going to get a little bit lost. If you have more than 2 characters talking, you probably want dialogue every time you want some kind of indication every time or every other time that you're switching who's talking, or there needs to be something in the context of the dialogue to indicate who's talking. Does that answer your question? You don't want too many tags, again, because your readers are smart and they want to follow the story themselves. They don't want a lot of author intrusion. But you need enough to make it make sense. Does that make sense? I know. Okay, so bouncing off that, let's talk a little bit about natural dialogue. So this is, I think, something that bugs me the most as a reader is when I'm reading a book and the dialogue does not sound natural. Either the characters aren't speaking how people of their station would speak, like, so age is a big one. It's really hard to write for little kids, I find, and when I'm reading people who are writing like 3 and 4-year-olds, I can always tell that they have not been around a 3 or 4-year-old in a while because they have no idea how they talk. So that age is a big one. You have to really be thinking about how old this person is and how that person would talk. So you want your dialogue to sound natural and realistic. Thinking about these things in your character development. Slang and informal speech patterns are perfectly acceptable in dialogue. I don't feel like you can't use ain't, y'all. Why not? If you're writing a book in the South, your characters are going to say those words. So you want to make it feel natural to everyday conversation. Contractions are a huge one for this. Unless you're in a fantasy setting or a setting from a further gone era, you want to make sure that you're using contractions in dialogue because that's how people talk. I don't sit up here and say do not, cannot, will not, should not. I say can't, won't, don't. That's how people talk. So you want to make sure that you're sounding very realistic. And those kind of things are going to be, things like slang and informal speech are going to be really natural for people like teenagers, your basic middle-class family. That's how we talk. Now, if you're talking about 2 rocket scientists sitting in a room trying to figure out the best formula for their rocket fuel, they're not going to probably speak like your middle-class family sitting down to have dinner, right? So again, natural, realistic. Are your characters' reactions appropriate? So let's say a bomb has exploded. Your characters probably aren't thinking like, oh man, that sucks. You know, that is not a natural reaction, you know? And even if you do have a character who's, let's say, Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, who might look at it and be like, wow, we should go study that. Or, you know, I don't know what he'd say, but he might have a different reaction than Howard Wolowitz would have. So you've got to think about your characters and what their reactions are going to be and are they appropriate to the situation and to what's being said. Dialogue should not sound like prose. If you're telling the story from first person, you can get a little bit more away with that because your character who is telling the story is probably, their dialogue is probably going to sound a little bit more like the prose. But if you're telling it from third person or if you're having somebody speak who is not the first person narrator, you want to make it sound a little different. Their rhythms and speech patterns are going to sound different than the other characters. Let's just take, for example, me and Phil today when we're talking up here. Phil had a lot lower speech, I think, because he's a guy, obviously, so you want to convey that. Whereas I'm a little bit more bubbly, and I'm a little bit more woohoo! So those are 2 different characters, we're 2 different people. You want to convey that in your speech. Does that make sense? You want to kind of vary your sentence length and structure based on your characters. And incomplete sentences are okay in dialogue because guess what? That's how people talk. People say okay, people say great, people say nah. You know, they say short, sweet things in conversation with each other. So it's okay if they say that in your dialogue.
Despite what MS Word says.
Exactly, despite what your Word document says. Even despite what some of your editors might say. People reading your dialogue might say, oh, that's an incomplete sentence. You're like, that's okay. If it's dialogue, it is okay. You know, even sometimes with prose, I say it's okay. Maybe not listen to me, but with dialogue, it's definitely okay. Exactly, artistic license. You're not writing an essay for your history teacher. You're writing a novel or a memoir, so you have this creative license to use those kind of things. On the other hand, realize that not all speech is interesting. Trim the parts that aren't. So this kind of goes back to moving the plot forward. If it doesn't move your plot forward, it's probably not interesting. Your reader probably doesn't want to hear about it. Like 2 people who haven't seen each other over a weekend, sitting down to tell each other about their weekend. If that weekend involved dragons and volcanoes erupting and hula girls who at the end of the book come back, great, talk about it. If it involves sitting on their couch watching a marathon of NCSI, probably not that interesting. Probably don't need to include it in your book. Don't use words like unless that's a character tick, because that can get kind of annoying. Be careful of starting your dialogue with filler words like well and so. This is a huge problem that I have. I do it all the time. I have to go out and cut it. Now for Nano, it might be good because you might want to up that word count, and so that's okay. I have no problems with that. But know that when you're going back through and editing, you're going to want to cut out words like well and so, because even though it seems like it's a good transition, it's not, and people don't say it that often. And if you take it out, the sentence has the exact same meaning. So even though you want your dialogue to be natural and realistic, you also want it to be interesting. So you have to walk that line. Be careful. Oh, I already said that. Names in dialogue. So names are a good way of helping your reader follow who's talking. So I might say, hey, Phil, how are you doing? He'd say, hey, Rachel, how are you doing? But we wouldn't have our whole conversation saying each other's names. I know who he is. He knows who I am. If I sit down and have coffee with my friend, I don't use her name in our conversation. I'm not like, oh, Jacqueline, you're so funny. Oh, Jacqueline, you're right. Oh, Jacqueline, yeah, I understand. You see how annoying that is, saying names over and over again? So, again, it can be a useful tool when used sparingly to keep the readers going with the flow of the dialogue and who's speaking, but be careful that you're not using it every other sentence. Does anyone have anything to add? Helping make your dialogue sound natural? Yes.
I have a question. How do you do really heavy accents?
Oh, I've never written a character with a heavy accent, but that's a great thing. I think you want to be careful with those. I think it's great to incorporate them, and you can, like in Harry Potter, Hagrid does have a little bit of that. He cuts off parts of his words, and it's easily readable. But I think when you're doing that, you need to be mindful of the person who's reading it and the audience. So I say it's okay to do, and sometimes you may even want to spell things differently, to convey that accent. Russian's very easy, change your W's to V's. I went to be pretty familiar with that. And that definitely, the way that you write somebody's speech is definitely going to give the reader a sense of who they are and help picture them and help them hear each other. But you have to be careful. I started reading a book. I don't even remember the name of it now. I was so excited that it got great reviews, and so I had my mom buy it for me for Christmas. Started reading it. The whole thing is written in this dialect that I can't really understand. It's English, but it's very, very, very difficult to read. And I'm spending an hour on a chapter trying to figure out what this person is saying. And I put it down and I never finished it. I was so excited to read it. So you got to be careful. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So you have to be aware if your reader hasn't come into contact with a person who has that, if they can't make that mental connection, oh, this is what that speech sounds like. You really do want to be careful because it can just end up being confusing. So if it's such a rare kind of dialect or accent or something, then it's not going to be readily apparent by either the specific words they're using, slang, cutting things off. Then
My self-published book, there's a portion of it that takes place in London, and so I mention the accents, and then I throw in some British slang and isms here and there, but I don't let it overpower the dialogue because my primary audience, I want British people to read it, but my primary audience is here in America. That's who I'm intending to sell the book to, although ironically enough, more people have bought it in the UK than here. But the idea is that you want it to feel natural and realistic by adding in those slang words, but you don't want it to overpower so that you're not moving the plot forward and things like that. So you don't want the reader to get lost in those kind of details. Yeah.
A really great example about somebody who does this very well is Scott Westerfield in his Hagrid series, which is really cool. And it is sci-fi set in America, though. Not sci-fi, but it's more dystopian future, but it is a little bit sci-fi. But he creates his own slang and lingo,
Yeah.
and speech patterns and all of this, and so it's recognizable. But at first, it takes some
I'm getting used to
it
it.
takes some reading, but after a while, it becomes so second nature. And I remember finishing it and thinking, wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool.
It's one of those things you have to do it so well that you kind of break the reader out of their habits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's the same in case anybody wants to read that. That's a great question. I wish I had more experience writing accents so I could answer to it better. Does anyone else in the room, have they written accents that they want to speak to that? Sorry. Okay. Anybody else want to touch on natural and realistic dialogue, ways that you try and incorporate it in your books, tips that you have, tricks, anything?
I would say the tip, I don't really agree, but it's just what I tell my students to do when they're working on their own thing, is recording yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So you can record yourself talking to someone and try and get a sense of those speech patterns
Yes.
and what people actually say.
That brings me to my next thing, which is exercises to improve your dialogue. Some of these you're probably going to have heard oftentimes, but that's because they work. So listen to conversations around you. Yes, I'm telling you to eavesdrop. Most writers are natural observers, so tap into that. Tune into the way people speak to each other. People at a restaurant, people at a grocery store, people at a yoga class, they're all going to talk to each other on different topics and in different ways than the other people. Lovers speak to each other differently than friends, friends differently than family, family differently than coworkers, etc. Your topics are going to vary depending on people's relationships and the setting. So eavesdrop, listen in, even jot some things down. Nobody's going to mind. They're never going to know. I mean, unless you go up and tell them, like, hey, that was a really interesting conversation. It's going to be my next book. Thanks. Nobody's going to do that, right? Okay. Watch TV and movies. Again, this is very obvious, but you're going to, if you find shows and movies that are similar in genre and observe how the characters interact, this is really going to help you with your dialogue. Study their facial and body reactions and try to describe them in your writing. Listen to the rhythm and timing of their conversations and try and distinguish natural from unnatural. So I think it's pretty easy for you to, like, if you're watching a pilot of a TV show, you can tell pretty quickly if it's going to be canceled or not, and it's usually because of the writing or the acting, and a lot of times a combination of the two. And if you hear people talking to each other and it doesn't sound natural at all, if their reactions don't sound natural, that is a good example of what not to do. So find those shows that are really, really bad and don't do them. Read. That's another huge one for to improve your dialogue. Go to your favorite books and study the dialogue, like we did with Harry Potter. Does it fulfill the three purposes: the plot, the character development, and the tension? Does it fulfill any of them? What about it does it fulfill? And how did the author achieve that? So really study the characters. And I think it helps to do books that you know really well as opposed to one that you're just reading off the bat. Because then if you know what happens later on, you can kind of see how they set it up. So reread your favorite books. I'm a huge proponent of rereading. And then, like she said, read your work aloud. Did you stumble over a piece of dialogue? Go back and ask yourself why. What about it doesn't sound natural? What about it is causing you to trip up? Is it too formal? Is it too informal? Is it too lengthy? Those are going to be big things in helping you to adjust your dialogue. And then my favorite thing that I like to do is write scenes that you aren't going to use. So one of the ways that I get to know my characters is by writing dialogue for them, having them have conversations with the other characters that have nothing to do with the plot or the tension. Just character development. This is going to help you get into the rhythm of their speech patterns. It's going to help you realize what words they use a lot, what words they don't. It's going to really pull out a lot of things because the way people talk in everyday life is how they talk usually all the time. I mean, this is how I talk. You know, hand gestures and wild and ups and downs and tones. You know, this is, if somebody were to write a character about me, that's things that they would need to include. So get to know your characters outside of your world, outside of the plot, and that's going to help influence what they say in the midst of it. Does anyone else have any exercises they use to improve their dialogue that they want to share?
Write short pieces of nothing but dialogue, no tags.
No tags, just going straight.
Just dialogue.
Mhm.
That can be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And can really teach you to convey.
convey all those things in just the words. Yeah. And that's also great for your word counts. Sometimes I find I have a really hard time writing prose. Like it's in description, I'm so bad at it. It's like the thing I'm worst at. So if I am short on my word count for a day, I will just sit down and write a whole bunch of dialogue. And that speeds it up. And it shows you kind of places where you need to increase tension and plot and things like that. So that's a great exercise. Just writing dialogue, no tags, and nothing else.
One thing I've heard of for editing is to take your dialogue out of the prose and tags, and then see if you can figure out who's saying which
Yeah.
one.
And if it makes sense. And that is important to see if you're writing effectively. Yes, dynamically. Love it. Anything else? Anything else? Okay, so what we're going to do, we have about 5 minutes left. So I want everyone to, you can get in pairs if you want, or you can do it individually. It's up to you. But I want you to write a scene of dialogue between two characters. They can be from your Nano novel. They can be from something else that you've done. And I want, in one of those characters does not want to be doing what they're doing. You can choose what that action is, what the scene is, but you are not allowed to have your character say, I don't want to do this. Okay, so you have to convey that they don't want to do something, and you have to tell us what it is that they don't want to do, but you can't tell us, I don't want to do this. Does that make sense? All right. Have fun, people.